Bueno, es un placer para nosotros presentarle al conferencista del eje de Ecología en esta primera jornada argentina de metodologías virtuales. Danilo es profesor asociado de Ecología en la Universidad de Nápoles Federico II y miembro honorario de la Universidad de Bristol del Reino Unido. Sus intereses incluyen selección de hábitat, división de recursos, ecología sensorial y comportamental, biología evolutiva, biogeografía y ecología de invasiones. Gran parte de sus investigaciones se centran en murciélagos, sin embargo también estudia una amplia gama de organismos modelo con la finalidad de responder diversas preguntas. Desde 2019 forma parte del Comité Científico Acuerdo para la Conservación de Poblaciones de Murciélagos Europeos y a su vez editor en jefe de la revista Mobile Review. Es el principal impulsor y presidente del Comité de Gestión de la Acción COS de la Unión Europea 𝐶-𝐣𝐚𝐦. Ha publicado más de 140 artículos científicos en revistas internacionales, tales como Nature Communication, Ecology Letters y Biological Review. Ha realizado trabajo de campo en muchas regiones del mundo, desde las selvas africanas hasta el desierto israelí y los bosques de hayas europeos. Bueno, sin más, los dejo con Danilo y espero que disfruten de su presentación. Danilo, the audience is all yours. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be here today. Thanks for the invitation. I had last second connection issues. I was a bit worried, but everything seems to be working fine now. Okay, so I will start by trying to share the screen. Well, today my talk will be about how it is like to be a bat in a human-dominated world. And I will concentrate on the role of winners versus losers. Please give me a sign.
Yes, yes, great. We can see you.
Okay, you know Murphy's law. Everything worked perfectly this morning, but now we're having issues with my connection. Anyway, I don't know what did you lose, but I will get back to this graph showing how we are losing species worldwide at, say, an unprecedented rate, and the pattern actually follows that of human population growth. So we're facing big problem. And you know that within this very general framework, we have a lot of losers of species that experience problems with human action. But we also have a few winners. Of course, this losers versus winners concept is a simplification, but it gives you the idea. And when it comes to bats, bats are quite an interesting group to test this, because it's a very biodiverse group with over 1,400 species. And they're very sensitive to human-driven environmental alteration. We know that many bat species worldwide are at risk. If you look at the data in the IUCN Red List, as shown by a recent paper by Frick et al., you can see that 15% of bat species are currently threatened. They are classified as either critically endangered or endangered or vulnerable. But 18% of species are data deficient. We cannot say that these species are not endangered, actually. Probably many of them will be. But simply we don't have enough information to say that. So 18% versus 13% of other mammals and 1% of birds. And 15% of bat species show unknown population trends versus 39% of other mammals and 8% of birds. So the general situation with bats is quite serious, I would say, from the conservation viewpoint. What is the problem of bats versus humans? Most bat species are harmed by human action, this is sure. And only a few tolerate or even thrive in human-transformed landscapes. So we have a lot of losers and a bunch of winners, as it were. The important point I would like to stress today is that winners are rarely studied. I would start by saying something about a loser. We published very recently a paper on this endemic species of bat. It's the Sardinian long-eared bat. It's an endemic species from Sardinia, from an island west of Italy. And this species was discovered in 2002, but ever since, its population literally crashed, declining from over 900 individuals to something like 350 individuals. And you can see that the species is restricted to a very narrow range of the island. It's located in the central portion of the island. So this is a classical example of loser. Where is the problem here? Well, we have several problems, but it seems that the variables that best explain this population crash are connected with climate change, directly or indirectly. Left, you can see, for example, that because the island is hit by recurrent wildfires, the yearly colony growth rate actually declined with the burnt area, the area affected by wildfires. Wildfires are human-induced, of course, but they are really favored by climate change. And summer precipitation also played a role, but I think one of the interesting points here is that heat waves expressed at the number of days when temperature was above 35 degrees also played an important role. So when you have more very hot days, you have a declining population growth. Okay, so overall, this species seems to be, of course, affected adversely by human disturbance, but indirectly by climate change as well. So let's move on to winners. We have a few examples, and I will use examples from my own studies for the last, say, 10 years or so, regarding urbanization, livestock farming, and climate change. And of course, I will give you European perspective because most of my work was actually set in Europe. So let's start from urbanization. We know that we are experiencing a crazy growth of human population living in urban environments. And it's predicted that by 2045, the number of people living in urban environments will be much higher than those living in rural environments, for example. So urbanization is going to be a serious issue, and it's going to be more serious in the next years. Many species simply do not cope with urbanization. Urbanization acts as an environmental filter which takes out a lot of species, allowing only a bunch of species to tolerate or even thrive in this situation. Here you can see an analysis we did a couple of years ago on the mammals that can be found in cities, in urban environments in general. And you can see the bats represent the richest group in terms of number of species present in cities. But we're still talking about 78 species, which is not that much compared to over 1,400 species that are part of this group. Okay, but still quite a good number of bats may use cities in different way, but may tolerate or do very well in cities. Generally speaking, the pattern you find, however, is that you will experience a decrease in diversity of bat communities, along with an increase of urban areas. This data come from a study regarding central and southern Italy, and you can see here that the richest bat communities correspond to areas, to landscapes where urban areas are not very represented. Okay, so there's a striking comparison, contrast, I would say, between areas with very little urbanization and a lot of species, and areas that are highly urbanized with just a bunch of species, very few species. A very general classification of how animal species may deal with urbanization is the following. You can broadly classify species as avoiders, adapters, or exploiters. And this is based on the degree to which species can tolerate disturbance and use and rely on human-provided resources. Looking at a theoretical fitness pattern such as this one, you may imagine different trends. For example, most losers will have a B pattern in terms of fitness, so fitness will decline along a gradient from rural through suburban to urban, while other species may show different patterns. For example, in C, you can see theoretical species which will thrive in a suburban context, whereas it will do not that better in rural conditions or in heavily urbanized areas. Some species may simply tolerate all conditions, and this is the theoretical A pattern. And so you can have you can imagine different responses. Of course, it's quite complicated to transpose this theoretical analysis into the real world because fitness is something which is not very easy to measure in all cases. We try to do something, and I'll show you in a second. And I will concentrate now on typical urban exploiters. This is a colony, nursery colony of European free-tailed bats, and it's one of the few species that can really thrive in urban contexts. And this guy is also very interesting. It's a species we've been working on for years. It's the cool pipistrelle, Pipistrellus cooley. It's a small bat which is found especially in southern Europe. But as I will show you later, its European range is expanding a lot in the last few years. And from these two graphs, you can see that, for example, nursery colonies, so maternity colonies, can anticipate births in response to an increase in percent of urban land cover, which means that these bats may actually give birth earlier in very urbanized contexts. And of course, giving birth earlier is an advantage because you will have a longer growth season when there's plenty of food, okay, to reach a mature stage and then emancipate. To the right, you can see a different pattern here. The estimated litter size is shown against the percentage of discontinuous urban habitats. And in this case too, you can see that the number of newborns recorded in the colonies will increase for increasing amounts of discontinuous urban habitats. So basically speaking, you can see that this species is favored in terms of productivity by this urbanization context. Of course, even within cities, even within urbanized environments, landscape quality counts a lot. The three graphs correspond to three different species which can be found in countries of in cities of southern Europe, such as Italy. To the left, we have again cool pipistrelle, center is 𝑖psugo-𝑠avi, Savi pipistrelle, and to the right, common pipistrelle. And here you can see that in urban lakes of Rome, we concentrated our efforts on foraging activity near lakes in green areas of the city of Rome. Again, the amount of woodland within 1 kilometer radius around lakes deeply affected positively foraging behavior by the species. So you have higher activity where you have more woodland surrounding these lakes. So again, when you say urban environment, it means little. You have to sort of analyze how the landscape will look like in terms of different landscape components to have an idea of how well a landscape can support different species. Okay, of course, weaning also implies risks. Roadkill, for example, cool pipistrelles, Savi's pipistrelles may easily forage near street lamps, but when they forage near street lamps, they will be exposed to roadkill. So it's one of these species are those that are commonly found killed by cars, for example. Many of the species typically worldwide roost in buildings, and of course, building destruction or renovation are very common and are serious threats to the conservation of these species in urban landscapes. And you also have conflict with humans and direct persecution, because sometimes the presence of colonies within buildings which host humans will lead to conflicting situations which end up in persecution. We also experience quite often the fall of newborns from roosts, and I'll tell you later that this is probably at least partly linked with heat waves driven by climate change, directly or indirectly. Insulation of modern buildings is also a problem, because we know that breathable roofing membranes may pose dangers. Bats may get entangled into these materials. And last but not least, cities are dangerous places because you also have predators which can be quite serious, such as cats or other synergic wildlife. Just want to show you an example colony of greater horseshoe bats from a national park in central Italy. And the colony seems to be doing very well. It's in a protected site. But one of the main threats to the colony we discovered is actually the presence of a couple of cats, which learned very easily to enter the roost and feed on juveniles falling from the colony. So we used camera traps and also did some dropping analysis to make sure that bats were part of the diet of these cats, and they do, unfortunately. Okay, this is my cat. You can see that it's not dangerous cat for wildlife. It's a sofa cat, but many other cats actually wander around, and they may have an impact on bats and many other wildlife species. We did a study a few years ago in which we showed that predation by cats is the first cause of rescue in rehabilitation centers for adult bats in Italy, affecting 11 species, which is a lot if you think that in Italy we have 35 bat species overall. So it's quite a nice number of the overall bat diversity of the country. One of the elements which is deeply connected with urbanization is artificial illumination at night. And you probably know that the artificial lighting has adverse effects on most bat species. And once again, we have just a few species that can cope with artificial illumination. Many others will be just repulsed by illumination. Again, we have typical urban species in Europe, such as 𝐾-𝐣𝐚𝐦, 𝑠abis, European free-tailed bat, which may forage near street lamps, for example. So they may exploit street lamps to catch prey. Many other species will just be excluded by illuminated areas. Look at this experiment we did some years ago, for example. We experimentally illuminated the segment of a river in a national park, again, the Abruzzo National Park in central Italy. And this experiment was quite interesting because we found that the typical prey of one of these bats present in the area, small dipterans, actually increased because of light. So if you light on the place, you will increase the amount of food present, okay? But at the same time, this 𝐼𝐴𝑑𝐻𝑦 bat will still be repulsed by the presence of light. So you'd expect the contrary, because food is more abundant, but you will still lose the predator just because they cannot cope with direct lighting of a place. And this is just an example, but this is what happens to many other species. But what happens to this typical urban dweller? Here you will find a very different situation, because these bats can tolerate light, at least for the short time needed to catch prey. I'm not saying that these bats are completely tolerant to artificial illumination. If you illuminate a roost, for example, the roost will be vacated for sure. It will be abandoned probably in a few days, but it will. But let's say that they can actually cross the light cone of a street lamp for the time needed to look for food and catch prey. In this graph, you can see the result of a radio tracking study we did on two urban dwellers, 𝐾-𝐣𝐴𝑑𝐻𝑦 and common 𝐾-𝐣𝐴𝑑𝐻𝑦. And in both cases, you can see a very nice relationship. We found that the overall time spent foraging for these bats will decline according to increasing percentages of foraging in lit areas, which simply means that it's very advantageous to forage in lit areas because you find a lot of food. And so you cannot bother spending a lot of time foraging in general. You can go back to the roost, rest, and interact socially. So there's a lot of energetic advantages behind foraging in lit areas, if you can tolerate this effect, this stressor. A very nice case we found, again regards 𝐾-𝐣𝐴𝑑𝐻𝑦. We were fortunate to use a historical series of bats in one of the main natural history museum of Italy, the Florence Natural History Museum. And we could count on a historical series of specimens spanning across something like 133 years. And we set out to measure body size and skull size of these guys and try to correlate it with different variables. The initial idea was to explore some correlation with climate change. But the data went elsewhere, actually, because we found that the skull of these bats, but not the overall body size, increased since the end of World War II. And we found a very nice correlation with artificial illumination at night, because actually, after the end of World War II, the country was completely covered with artificial lighting. So what happened? Normally, these bats would hunt prey in naturally dark habitats. And in this condition, they mostly go for very small prey, such as dipterans, okay? And there is one prey item they will never be able to catch: tympanite moths. You probably know that many moth species evolve this very nice defense against bats. They have tympanic organs, which are sensitive to ultrasound. So when prey is bombed with echolocation calls from an approaching bat, the moth will simply display an antipredatory behavior, such as, for example, just closing the wings and falling down, or performing some loops and so on. So they can actually detect loud echolocation calls and avoid a predator. And of course, under naturally dark conditions, this kind of prey would be unavailable to a shouter such as these bats, just because they would be alarmed. But there's something very interesting. When tympanite moths are attracted by street lamps, this anti-predatory behavior is impaired. So under those very special conditions, the predator will be able to catch kind of prey item which would be otherwise unavailable. Okay, and notice that these moths are quite larger than the average small prey taken by these bats in natural dark habitat. So possessing a larger skull will mean to have a strong advantage in terms of prey capture and handling. So our conclusion was that probably the slight but significant skull size increase we recorded in these bats could be interpreted as a microevolutionary tracking of new prey. So natural selection at work, which in the course of a few generations pushed the population towards selection for larger skulls. Of course, this is speculation, but I think it's quite intriguing, something quite interesting. Let's move on to the effects of lighting on drinking behavior. You know that drinking for bats is very sensitive behavior, because they skim over the water surface and take a sip, okay? So it's very complex maneuver, which is quite dangerous for bats, because if a bat touches down on water not in a correct way, it will get wet, and it will be very difficult for them to avoid predators, because what they do normally, they swim to the closest emerging objects and will dry before flying away. But of course, in that situation, bats will be exposed to predation. And it's not surprising that light is a serious threat to drinking bats. We, again, experimentally illuminated, this time drinking sites, in very different environmental contexts, in beach forests of central Italy, but also in the desert of Israel. And in both cases, we found that bats adversely reacted to light. In most cases, they just go away, or have a lot of problems in carrying out a correct drinking maneuver. Okay, here in these graphs, you can see the dark blocks, which correspond to the drinking activity as recorded under dark condition, which was our control, and light gray blocks correspond to what we recorded when the the site was artificially illuminated. And you can see that in many species, actually in all species we recorded, there's a clear decline in terms of drinking activity from the high levels recorded under dark conditions to the relatively small activity found when lights were on. And this not only regards clutter specialists, so forest species, which are sort of more deeply affected by artificial illumination, but it also concerned, and this was quite surprising, species such as cool pipistrelles or ipsugosabi or common pipistrelles, which are species that normally forage near street lamps. So it seems that drinking behavior is something even more sensitive than foraging behavior, as much as these species, which normally cope with lighting in terms of foraging, will still have problems when it comes to drinking. More recently, we played a bit with experiments of how sound might have an effect on bats. You know that light is largely explored in terms of effect on bats, but sound is really, the effects of sound are really not much studied. And there are a few studies suggesting that sound may affect adversely bats, but I mean, number of papers can be counted on the fingers of a single hand, okay? So what we did in Israel this time, we played back Israeli pop music to bats, which was quite unusual, not only for bats, but for us as well. I mean, because it was very loud. And it was a medley of different songs put together. And it was quite annoying for the experimenters and people in the place. But what happened to bats? It was quite surprising to see that we had effects on bats too. You know, it was something not really expected, because much of the acoustic world of bats lies in the ultrasonic frequencies, okay? While most of this music was actually in the audible range. So we were really surprised in seeing that, for example, in a small pond in the middle of nowhere in the desert, the number of unsuccessful drinking events increased when the music was broadcast. So soon after the music was broadcast, these bats seemed to be confused. And we could say that because what we did was to use ultrasonic recordings of echolocation calls. The pond was small, so actually if you place your microphones wisely, not only can you record echolocation calls, but you can also record the splashing sound produced by a bat when it will touch down on water. And in this situation, you can actually record that particular event as a successful drinking event. So by doing so, we actually understood that music could impair drinking success by increasing the number of drinking attempts a single bat will do before drinking successfully. What about farming? You know, there's a huge amount of work done on farming and also on bats in farming, really. And the general theory behind all these studies is that farming is a source of disturbance. And you know that in ecology, there's an important hypothesis, the so-called intermediate disturbance hypothesis, postulating that an intermediate level of disturbance will be corresponding to higher levels of biodiversity, okay? So if you decrease the amount of disturbance, then you will go towards lower levels of biodiversity. But on the other hand, also if you increase the level of disturbance, then you will lose species. When it comes to farming, this means that traditional farming, which lies in the middle between land abandonment and intensive farming, will likely host more species in terms of animals and plants. What about bats? We concentrated our attention on livestock farming because it's the most widespread human activity. It dominates rangeland ecosystems worldwide. I'm talking about open range livestock farming. And we know that it has major environmental effects. If you think about overgrazing, trampling, all these impacts will imply a loss of biodiversity. And we know that very well from thousands of previous studies. But what happens with bats? So what we did was to compare 3 different situations. Imagine you have an experimental site where you have cattle, another where you have only their dung. Dung may potentially attract insects, so bad food. And then you have a third situation, which may act as a control, where you have neither cattle nor dung. Okay, if you set out to measure activity levels of bats, foraging activity of bats, under these three different conditions, you will find that the highest levels of bat activity or foraging activity will be recorded near livestock. Okay, you also have a sort of intermediate activity level, only dung, and the lowest levels will be the control. So this is quite interesting because it tells us that it is the presence of livestock themselves which can attract bats. Okay, and it is easy to imagine why, because there are a lot of blood-sucking insects which actually pester livestock, and these insects can be captured by bats. Okay, so the presence of cows, of livestock, may attract these insects and consequently may encourage bat activity. Look at what happens with herd size. We found that the number of bat passes will increase along with herd size. So the more numerous the herd, the higher foraging activity, until you reach a sort of threshold, which is probably related to the incapacity of bats to handle a huge number of flying insects around. So you have sort of bottleneck, which is determined by the numbers of predators available. So if you think well about this, besides being very interesting from the ecological viewpoint and also the evolutionary viewpoint, because we know that something very similar also happens with wild ungulates, for example. So you can imagine that when humans swept away large ungulates and replaced them with livestock, with pastoralism, then bats probably shifted their attention from wild ungulates to domestic ones. Okay, so it's very fascinating from the evolutionary viewpoint. But in terms of ecosystem services provided by bats, this is also very interesting because we know that, for example, mosquitoes can lead to a loss of weight in cattle and decrease milk production. So there's big issue with animal welfare, but also with production related to the effect of these insects. And probably bats, do us a silent favor, I would say, by catching this very small but nasty prey. So let's spend a few words about climate change. Climate change is a huge subject, and these days, I mean, we are witnessing a lot of not always very useful, I would say, discussions about climate change. We know that climate change has huge consequences on biodiversity. That's one of the many issues with climate change. And there are several studies published on the current effects of climate change on bats, and several more looking at predictions of what's going to happen to bats with climate change. There are already problems. We know that, for example, heat waves linked with climate change in Australia, as well as in some areas of the Mediterranean, have led to significant die-offs. So many bats just die because of these thermal waves which kill them. We also know that climate change may have consequences in terms of lactation and reproduction in bats, but it could also play a role in exposure to diseases, because climate change may lead to problems with the immune system, and then this will be linked to a reduced capacity of bats to cope with parasites, for example. And of course, the most the simplest thing we can think of is the loss of suitable range. Okay, so the areas occupied by bats today will not be the same in a few years ahead, just because temperatures and precipitations are changing, which has consequences in terms of mismatches between bats and prey, of course, and ecosystem services bats currently provide. You know very well when we speak of range shifts, we also know that these are hampered by hostile landscapes. Urbanization, agriculture, and so on can actually block this expansion of shift of species to higher latitudes. So again, we know about a couple of winners in Europe, and one is the 𝐾-𝐣𝐴. We know that this species, since 1980, increased its European range by 400%. And we played a bit with different variables, and it was quite clear that the best models explaining the expansion of the species experience are those comprising climate change on climate only. So we know that this species actually expanded its range thanks to climate change, first of all. Then, of course, urbanization, artificial lighting may, on a smaller resolution, on a smaller scale, play a role. But climate change is the main driver. This other guy, 𝒂-𝒑𝒏 is also very interesting, and it's one of the species which are expanding across Europe. This species, we found by radio tracking these animals, can actually experience very high skin temperatures. We radio track the bats, and we use tiny transmitters with heat sensors. We could actually measure the skin temperature of these bats real time, and we know that these bats may overheat up to 46.5 degrees Celsius, which is the highest temperature ever recorded for a bat. So that's a desirable property, of course, under a climate change scenario. It's not surprising that this bat is doing well today, while many other species will probably experience problems. And of course, we can only imagine what's going to happen in terms of competition. We know very little about interspecific competition among bats. We recently published a review paper on this, but this is likely to occur under climate change because the communities, the way we see them today, are made of species that established, I would say, ecological interactions over a very long time. But what happens when a newcomer will, add to a previously established community, probably pushing others away? This is probably leading to competition scenarios, which we can only imagine today. So the community effects are unknown and difficult to predict. So I will conclude my talk just by stressing why studying winners matters. First of all, because winners provide us invaluable knowledge about bat ecology. They're just interesting. But also because if you want to carry out intelligent conservation, I would say, you really need to know what losers lack. So that's something we can learn from winners. And maybe we can use that experience to implement conservation strategies to be applied to losers. And of course, another very important point is that we can predict or understand the effects of community changes, for example, under climate change scenarios. And of course, don't forget ecosystem services. Take insectivory, for example. No? It's clear that rare species do catch insects. Some of them are pest species, but the bulk of insectivory is actually carried out by common bat species. So it is common bat species which will provide the most of ecosystem services. And this is a book chapter we have now in press on ecosystem services by bats in urban areas. And if you have a global view of bats, you will find that there are bats catching insects, but also pollinating plants or disseminating seeds in urban areas as well, worldwide. And bats are also an ecotouristic source of attraction. So again, very important ecosystem service. If you concentrate on insectivory, you will find that bats in urban areas will feed on many pest insects, okay? Insects that are a problem as nuisance because they are plant pests, disease vectors, or because they damage stored products. And final very important point, in my opinion, it is common bats that people get to know most frequently. People living in large urban areas will seldom see rare species, but they will quite often encounter common bats. For example, when you do bat walks, okay, with people, we have, for example, the European bat night, when many bat researchers and conservationists take people for a walk with bat detectors, so people get to know bats much better. And of course, the bats that will be encountered more often are these city ambassadors, I would call them, synergic bats. Okay, so I'm finished here, and just want to thank the many collaborators who helped me a lot in publishing what we've published so far. Gareth Jones from Bristol University, Carmi Corine from University of Negev in Israel, and Jens Riedel, who unfortunately passed away earlier this year. All these guys provided a huge contribution to my work. Thanks very much.